thank you for joining us for this Facebook Live on vaccine hesitancy. I'm Heather Lewis, and first and foremost, I want to be clear, we in no way are trying to convince people to get vaccinated, but there is a lot of misinformation out there, and as journalists, we just want to bring you facts so you can make up your own mind with information from reliable sources. An anonymous panel recently did a study for KOLR 10. It showed 80% of people trusted their doctors as the best source to get information. We'll get more to those results with our Dr. Brian Calfano in just a bit. But first, let's bring two physicians into the mix who work in the Ozarks and are used to answering questions about the Moderna, Pfizer, and Johnson & Johnson vaccines. We have Dr. David Barb. He's a family doctor in Mountain Grove. He's also the Vice President of Primary Care for Mercy Springfield Communities and the President of the World Medical Association. Dr. Casey Morton is the Pediatric Medical Director at Jordan Valley Community Health Center and also a hospitalist at Cox Health. Now, we asked people on the KOLR 10 Facebook page why they are vaccine hesitant and what are their questions about the vaccines. So we want to get into those questions, first talking about the FDA approval and efficacy. And today, by the way, the FDA did give full approval of the Pfizer vaccine for those 16 and older. The 2-dose shot was authorized for emergency use in December and was authorized for children 12 and older in May for emergency use. That full FDA approval carries the FDA's strongest endorsement of a product. And among other steps, it usually requires 6 months of safety follow-up. So let's get to our first question here. It is about FDA approval and efficacy. And this says, I don't see how it is humanly possible for them to come up with a vaccine for this in a year, as it took vaccines for chickenpox, measles, polio, etc., many years to do that. My question is, how effective are all the vaccines if the people that are fully vaccinated are carriers of the Delta variant? This comes from Elizabeth S. And Dr. Barb, I want to get to you as well, because we were talking about this just before this Facebook Live, the full FDA approval for the Pfizer vaccine coming today. Go ahead and first give me your thoughts on that, and then also let us know about this question about just how long it takes to develop a vaccine and why this is safe.
So this is a monumental day with respect to approval of the Pfizer vaccine. We've been waiting for this for a long time. I've had both sides of this question. How can they do it so quickly, and why has it taken so long? It took the time that it took because they wanted to be very, very sure that there was as much information as possible on both the safety as well as the efficacy of the vaccine. And so it was a very deliberate process. And I'm glad to say that today they decided that they could go ahead with the full approval. How could we do this in less than a year from the time the COVID epidemic hit us until the time we had a vaccine in December of 2020? Partly because the technology is better now, it's faster, we have greater computing power, we can do experiments much more rapidly and in parallel with one another rather than in a series one after another. The other thing is, there had been work on an mRNA vaccine for a number of years, greater than a decade. And much had been learned during that time, so that when now we needed a vaccine that could be rapidly not just developed but produced so that it could be deployed in the population as rapidly as possible, the mRNA vaccine met those criteria.
Dr. Morton, I want to ask you this next question. It deals with the booster shots as well, and it comes from Tammy H. She said, I didn't and still honestly don't feel that they know enough about the vaccines. If they did, we wouldn't need multiple doses or boosters. So when it comes to boosters, what are we still learning about that?
So I think with the boosters, what we're learning is that the efficacy is very good for these vaccines, but we still need more time and research to see how long they will be effective in our systems against the different variants. One thing that we didn't anticipate, or that we did anticipate but we didn't know if it would still be effective, is how many variants there would be and if the vaccines would still be effective. So with boosters, we know that they will be given if we see that decrease in that. And the immunocompromised right now are the ones we're the most concerned about. And in the future, just looking at the different options that we have, boosters may be needed, but it still means that the vaccines work.
And when we talk about the vaccines working as well, Dana had this question, Dana B, why are the vaccinated still dying and spreading COVID as well?
Well, we know that the majority of the patients that are in the hospital and dying are unvaccinated. It's less than 1% that are hospitalized that are vaccinated and can still die. But most of those people that are dying from COVID-19 that are vaccinated have comorbidities like obesity, diabetes, different things that can affect their outcomes.
Dr. Barb, did you have any additional comments on that?
So what Dr. Morton says is right, and what we know is if you have been vaccinated, you have almost a 2.5 times better chance of avoiding a second infection. A lot of people talk about whether they need the vaccine if they've already had COVID, and the answer is absolutely you do. We do know that the immunity diminishes over time. We think it stays pretty good for about 6 months, but it probably does begin to drop off after that. There was a study released fairly recently, though, that, as I indicate, they looked at people who had the natural disease and then got it a second time compared to those who had been vaccinated and then got sick. And it's almost a 2.5 times greater risk of getting it a second time if you are not vaccinated, if you're just relying on your natural immunity. So it is really important to be vaccinated even if you have had COVID once. It really does boost our immunity.
And does the different variants, specifically the Delta variant, does that play into a role of why you are still recommending the vaccine, because it is kind of tweaking the way it's working?
You know, so yes is the answer to your question. The Delta variant, as Dr. Morton said, kind of threw us a curve. It is much more infectious, spreads easier, more likely to produce a clinically recognizable illness. And when we talk about the vaccine effectiveness tapering off, we're not talking about going from 90% to 0. The studies that have been done so far show that it goes from the 90 to 95% effectiveness down to about 80 or 85% effective. So it is still very, very effective. And as Dr. Morton said, of the number of patients in the hospital, many more of them, but 90% are unvaccinated compared to only a very small number, 10% or so, that have been vaccinated and then get sick enough to be in the hospital again.
And we had a few remarks from people saying they don't trust the vaccines because no one's really held liable if something goes wrong. DJV says, my biggest concern is that if I have an adverse reaction, who is liable? Insurance doesn't cover it because it's not FDA approved. We now know the Pfizer vaccine is. And you can't go after the pharmaceutical companies because they are protected. So who's going to cover my hospital bills as being a reason as to why he has decided not to take the vaccine? Not sure which one of you want to tackle that question, but who would be held liable? And this obviously is a concern for some people.
So I think that anytime that you take a medicine or a vaccine or do anything in life, really, there's a risk. So the risk, you know the risks, you do the consent, you sign those things for vaccines, but we know that those vaccines are safe, and there's such a small percentage of patients that have any issues with the vaccines that it's much more safe to stay alive with the vaccine than to die because you didn't get the vaccine. There's lots of medications out there, there's lots of things we do on a daily basis, things we eat, things we do, that we know that those have risks. But there's nobody liable for those things. Those are the choices that we make, and that we have to do those things. So I feel like there's nobody liable, but you do have your physicians, you do have the people that you can go to if anything happens, and they do have a reporting system so that we know that. And that's why this EAU was developed in the first place, is so they can continue to watch and see what kind of issues arose, if there were any complications, if there were any side effects. And then they put the FDA approval because it has been shown to be so safe.
Okay, very good. And Christy R. actually asked a question that I think we've already answered with Dr. Barb. Why should we get the vaccine if we have already had COVID? Why put something artificial in us when we have natural antibodies? And if you want to kind of reiterate that answer for us.
Natural antibodies are very good. We do know that they protect. Just like the antibodies, though, after a vaccine, we don't know for sure how long they last. And we do know that they are not as good at protecting us against the variants as the vaccine is. So it is very important to consider vaccinating even if you've had COVID. The side effects also really are modest. The side effects are greater after the second dose than after the first dose, at least statistically. But even at that, most of the reactions that are reported are mild to moderate at the most. Of the patients that I have seen, even those that had the most reaction to the vaccine felt out of sorts or uncomfortable, some fever and some body aches, headache, just for 2 or 3 days afterwards. I've had patients tell me, I felt pretty rough by the second day, but I got up on the morning of the third day and I was okay again. That's a small price to pay for the protection of not getting COVID. I think many times people say, or don't think about the relative risk of the vaccine versus the risk of the disease itself. And every complication you can think of is many-fold worse with the natural disease than with the vaccine.
And you know, something that's tricky about this virus is that not everyone has symptoms with it. And you don't know if you're going to be that person who has symptoms or not. We did have one question from Matt C. He said, if I am asymptomatic after exposure to COVID, why would I want to take a vaccine whose only purpose is to lessen those symptoms? Dr. Morton?
So if you take the vaccine to lessen the symptoms, some people are asymptomatic, as you stated. It's more protective of getting the COVID-19 again, as well as potentially spreading the disease to other people. We know that we can have the disease and not have symptoms, but we can still spread it to those that we are around, and that's still increasing the burden of disease on the community.
Now, a lot of people also did mention side effects. They want to know what they are, the full scope of them. Several mentioned deaths from the vaccine, blood clots, stroke. Can you explain the risk and also explain the vaccine adverse event reporting system, Dr. Morton, that you had just mentioned as well? Because it is self-reporting, so how reliable is that?
There's multiple concerns with the strokes and different things like that, but the one thing that Johnson & Johnson for sure had with the strokes is that it was 6 different cases. So they were very particular in evaluating those very carefully, and that's where the VAERS system comes into play. The VAERS system is something that is self-reported, so if you have any issues, then you report those to your physician, and those get reported to the system, to the VAERS reporting system. If you were to have any major issues, those will be contacted, you'll be found out about those things. The issues with VAERS is also a reporting bias, so how many people think that there is maybe a side effect that wasn't truly related to the vaccine. So it has to be kind of figured out.
And Dr. Barber, I do want to ask you this as well, because Carrie W. had something that relates to this. She said, how can we trust the science when the data mandates for reporting are non-existent? And again, that goes back to, I think, talking about the VAERS self-reporting system, but are there mandates for reporting adverse reactions?
So there are indeed, and in fact, part of the reason that there are so many reports regarding the COVID vaccinations in VAERS is because it is mandatory. It is a higher bar for reporting of adverse events for the COVID vaccinations than it is for any other vaccination. You have to think of VAERS as an extremely wide-mouth funnel. This is the top of the funnel. We want to gather as much information, whether we think it's related or not. Anything that happens adversely after a COVID vaccination must be reported through VAERS. Then behind the scenes, the CDC and others sort through those, look at the medical records, try to determine if there is any connection. VAERS makes no connection between an event and a cause. Causality is not part of what VAERS does. That takes multiple other steps to try to determine, was there a relationship between that event and the vaccine? And what we have found recently is, other than anaphylactic reactions, those severe, sudden allergic reactions that occur in the first 15 to 30 minutes after the vaccination, other than those, the number of severe reactions to COVID vaccine have been extremely small, literally 1 in a million type of reactions. The moderate reactions, the sore muscles, the headache, the fever, those are much more common, of course. Severe reactions, life-threatening reactions, extremely low.
Now, something else that I think is creating some skepticism or maybe mistrust is incentives. And Stephanie J. says, why are they bribing people to take the vaccine if it is so safe? So I'm curious as to what your perspective is on the incentives, if they're working to get people vaccinated, or if they are creating more mistrust within our community. And Dr. Morton, we'll start with you.
I think that the incentives are in regards to the fact that our vaccine levels are a lot lower than we want to see them. I think that we anticipated or really hoped that everybody would do their part and get their vaccinations to stop the spread of COVID-19. And when we saw the low numbers and knowing that we need to get to around 75% originally for vaccine herd immunity, then that we haven't gotten there. And now with the variants, it's probably likely needs to be around 75 to 85%. So to increase that vaccine distribution and get people to be responsive to it, I think that the incentives are great. I think that they're a very good opportunity for patients and families to take advantage of those incentives, as well as to increase our vaccine rates so that we can move on and end this pandemic at some point in time.
You know, one thing we haven't talked about yet today, and that is the misinformation and incomplete information, lack of understanding of the safety of the vaccine, lack of understanding of the potential side effects of the vaccine. And what we're doing today is to try to correct some of the misinformation or fill in the gaps for those that are watching today. The incentives and requirements for vaccination have multiple purposes. One is to encourage those who maybe have been a little hesitant to go ahead and do so. Many people have suggested, well, you can't make me and you shouldn't make me get a vaccine. I tend to agree with that, but mandatory vaccination in certain settings, like in healthcare institutions, is critically important for a variety of reasons. And we will see health systems. Mercy has done it here locally so far. Cox will follow soon, I feel confident, especially now with the FDA approval. Many other health systems around the country have done so. Over 60 national medical organizations representing medicine, nursing, and pharmacy have come out in favor of mandatory vaccination for healthcare workers. So while it doesn't mean you have to take the vaccine, it means if you're going to work in these settings, being vaccinated is critically important.
And I think you did mention something that a lot of people say they're not hesitant. They just don't want to be told what they should do. They want to make that decision for themselves and shouldn't have to be mandated for it. And you also mentioned just the misconceptions of getting the full context of what the vaccine is and its medical research as well. Where is the best place to get research from?
So there are many sources, and I know that there is some skepticism about the CDC, but the CDC gathers studies from around the country and literally around the world, and after reviewing those for integrity of the data and of the interpretation, they then post them on their website across many topics related to COVID. But I would also look to other reputable universities and professional organizations for reliable information. New England Journal, the American Medical Association's family of journals, universities. Johns Hopkins has put out a ton of information, very reliable, and many other universities and medical colleges have done the same thing. What I would steer you away from are some of the fringe sites, quite honestly, those sites that are perpetuating misinformation or incomplete information. We haven't talked much today about things like ivermectin. The international studies that have been touted regarding those have been studied by other experts and found to be very lacking in their scientific integrity. And the experts in this country, the vast majority, do not believe that is either safe or effective, particularly when it's used from veterinary sources, for instance. One of the things that I tell people when I talk is look at the preponderance of the evidence. Can you find a study that says something different somewhere? You probably can. But when, and I'll just use as an example, if 10 studies say this thing and there's one study that says this thing, which would you rather I use as a professional? If I was treating your diabetes and 10 studies says this is the best new drug to use for diabetes, and one said, well, I don't know, maybe not. Do you want me to follow the maybe not article, or do you want me to follow the 10 articles that say this is really important in the treatment of diabetes? Same thing applies in COVID. Multiple studies show the safety and the efficacy of the vaccine. Multiple studies have debunked some of the misinformation. We need to go with the preponderance of the evidence and not pick out potentially unreliable study that says something different.
And we had more than 1,100 comments on our Facebook post about vaccine hesitancy. I wish we could get to them all. We tried to hit the ones that had the most interactions with them. Thank you, Dr. Barb and Dr. Morton, for being here today and clearing up some of the misconceptions and also just giving your perspective as local doctors who interact with patients every day. And again, you know, we always recommend going to your local doctor to get the best information for you. So thank you both for being here today for more information. And we want to bring in our Dr. Brian Calfano now. He's joining us live from Cincinnati, Ohio. KOLR 10 recently did a research and analysis of media study, and we asked people in the Ozarks to be part of this just to get feedback on the vaccine here in the Ozarks. And we should note this study was done prior to the full FDA approval of the Pfizer vaccine today. Dr. Calfano, good afternoon, and let's break down the findings of that RAM study. We had about 153 respondents. What did these statistics show about people who are non-vaccinated?
Well, some interesting things, Heather, and it's good to be with you and with the doctors today. In terms of the breakdown of our sample, you see here on the screen that women are leading the way in saying that they are not vaccinated. 63% of women in our panel study said that they didn't get the vaccine. I should say 63% of those who didn't get vaccinated or said they didn't have the vaccine were women. 37% were men. What is also interesting in this, Heather, is that the percentage along the age categories is pretty much split. 22% of those who are not vaccinated are 18 to 44 years old. 29% are between 45 and 54, and 27% between 55 and 64, 23% 65 plus. So on the two ends there, the younger and the older members of the panel saying they're not vaccinated, they're the ones who, if you want to look at it this way, are perhaps as those age cohorts, the least likely to say that they're not vaccinated. And then the big finding from this slide is that those who say they lean conservative, politically conservative, are overwhelmingly represented in this subgroup of those in our panel saying that they are not vaccinated. As you see there, 86% of those saying they're not vaccinated in the panel lean conservative compared to 14% who say they lean to the political left.
What were some of the reasons for turning down the vaccine from the findings that we got?
Yeah, this is fascinating. You should see this now on your screens. Concern over long-term side effects. And as you said, this panel sample was taken before the FDA's announcement this morning about the Pfizer shot. But 90% of folks in our panel sample said they were worried about the possibility of those long-term side effects. Next up in terms of frequency would be concern over the effectiveness. So in a sense, the general view expressed by some of the folks who left comments and questions for our doctors today, that they just don't understand how it could be that this vaccine that's so new, according to their language, could be effective. So there's a concern there that the vaccine is just not effective enough to actually warrant taking it. Then you've got almost 60%, Heather, 59% of the panel saying that they just don't trust the government. And this is a fascinating finding because this weekend, former President Trump, who pushed through this Operation Warp Speed that folks might remember from a year ago, which got us these vaccines in the record time that they were produced, suggested to the folks at a political rally that they ought to get vaccinated. And his supporters, former President Trump's supporters, basically turned on the president, the former president, I should say, and booed him for a few lines while he suggested it's a good idea to get the vaccine. And President Trump backed off on that a little bit in the rest of his comments. But it just shows you in some way the deep-seated concern that some folks have about anything coming from the government, even when it's a message from a trusted messenger and someone like former President Trump telling his supporters to go get a vaccine. That's just not something that they wanted to hear. Then there's the concern about short-term side effects, like the doctors were speaking of a few minutes ago, fever, headaches, those sorts of things from the shot. 57% of our panel said that was a reason that they were not going to get the vaccine. And then just a general hesitancy to take any kind of vaccine. This is this sort of what they call anti-vax movement that has been in the news for almost a decade and a half now. There's this general sense among many people that they just don't think vaccines are a good idea. And they may or may not think that vaccines are some big conspiracy. They're not all in this anti-vax group, that's for sure. But there's the general sense that if I don't have to put something unnatural in my body, I don't want it. And that rounds out the top 5 reasons people gave us, Heather, in terms of why they say they're not getting the COVID vaccine.
You also mentioned politics playing a role in this as well. Can you explain a little bit more in depth about what we found out about politics here in the Ozarks and how it's playing a role in people choosing not to get the vaccine?
Yeah, exactly. And you'll see now on the screen that we were able to break down responses in the panel along political ideology. And there's a couple of interesting findings here in terms of how folks who say they're liberal versus conservative think. And if you look at that first statement, basically these percentages you're seeing are the percentage of agreement, the number of people in the panel who said they agreed with the particular statement. So this first statement reads, the vaccine could have mild to moderate side effects, but these are better than becoming severely ill. Well, what's interesting here, 77% of those who say they're liberal say, I agree with that statement, right? 56% of those who say they're conservative also agree, because it's in folks' best interest not to be sicker, right? Everybody, or most people in the sample, including majorities of liberals and conservatives, agree with that. But getting back to the larger point of just a general skepticism about the effectiveness of this vaccine, you see a larger split in that second statement, Heather. The second statement reads, the vaccine is effective and will protect me from becoming seriously ill with COVID. 79% of those who say they're liberal, they're in agreement with that. But only 45% of conservatives in our panel agree. And that, again, harkens back to the general skepticism about the vaccine's effectiveness. And you're seeing this breakdown here along political, ideological lines in our sample.
You know, we talked to the doctors a lot about where to get information because there is so much information and so much misinformation out there as well. What did our respondents find about the most reliable source that they trust to get the information from?
Well, no surprise here, and the slide should show, these are different entities that people said they were confident in considering as a reliable source. And so folks were able to pick more than one, which is why the percentages here do not add up to 100. 86% of the sample, Heather, said doctor, reliable source of information, followed by hospital leaders. So we've had folks from the hospital systems on and talking about the importance of getting the vaccine. So you'd think, okay, well, that's 2 really reliable sources in the eyes of folks in this panel. Media, well, we got to work a little harder, I guess, to be considered a reliable source. We're only at 3%. Neighbors, 1%, so they're the lowest. Relatives, they're a little bit better than us in the media, 9%. And then others, there's this other category. Fully 14% of the panel sample said others were a reliable source. And those others included the CDC and the FDA and other entities. And so encouraging, at least, the reason we wanted to bring doctors on to talk to us today is that the majority of folks in our panel are saying doctors are the most reliable source, or the largest percentage of folks in the panel said doctors are the reliable source for information about COVID vaccines.
So let's talk about these people who were on the panel. They were anonymous. We don't have the information specifically of who they are, but we do know the vaccination status of the people who responded as well. So what do we find about this sample that we gathered?
Well, we think we know the vaccination status. This is the fun part of doing survey research, because if you look, 72% of our panel said they've had at least 1 dose of a COVID vaccine. 72% versus 28% of the panel saying that they didn't have any dose at this point. Now, why is this interesting, and why am I a little skeptical about our panel in this response? Well, if you look at the health department data for Greene County, and that's, I think, our highest vaccinated county in our media market, the percentage of those with 1 to 2 doses is in the 40% range. For Christian County, it's also in the 40-some% range. But when you talk about Polk County, Stone County, Taney County, those health department percentages are in the 30% range. So how do we find a panel of folks where 72% are saying that they've had at least 1 of the shots? Now, I'm not necessarily saying the folks are fibbing here, but there is a phenomenon that social scientists talk about called social desirability bias, in the sense that people don't want to admit, even in an anonymous internet survey, because that's what this panel survey was, that are engaging in behavior that might be looked down upon by others. And with all of the push that is happening from various sectors of our society to get vaccinated, there might be a hesitancy on the part of some to admit that they haven't gotten a vaccine. This is a certain type of human behavior that is seen across issues. This isn't just about COVID vaccines. This is something that you see a lot of in survey research. And it's a reason why it's good to continue to check with what the health department percentages are showing in terms of folks who are vaccinated versus what these surveys show. It's always possible that we just happen to have a panel of folks talking to us who are really into getting the vaccine, which is great. But it's also possible that we're talking about some folks who maybe they feel like they don't want to admit that they have yet to get the vaccine. The good news is there's always time for people who haven't gotten the vaccine to get it if they so choose.
So taking a look at all the findings that we've just talked about, do these findings point to any trends that we should expect to see here in the Ozarks?
Continued concern about information and where people are getting information, I think, is a big one. Because if you have a majority of people, in our panel at least, saying that doctors are a trusted source of information when it comes to the COVID vaccine, yet you see less than 50% of the population not turning out to get the vaccine, there's a disconnect there. There's some hesitancy in the sense that people, they just don't feel as comfortable as they need to internally to make that decision. So you can still have people look to their doctors for information, but they're not going to turn the decision over entirely to what their doctors tell them or what the hospital leaders tell them or the information on the CDC site and that sort of thing. I think this is really a process by which people eventually become convinced by the totality of the information in front of them. And when you add in discussions with other folks, people in their family, friends, people doing research online to see what the latest health reports show from a medical journal and those sorts of sources, combine all of those, and I think you're going to see a continued trickle toward higher vaccination rates. But there's also, I think one of the doctors was talking about a few minutes ago, which is something called confirmation bias. You have people who have just made the decision that they're not going to trust what the government tells them about vaccines. They're not going to trust that this COVID vaccine is effective, and they're not going to trust the COVID vaccine is safe. And so what they'll do is they'll throw out the 99 sources of information that tell them the vaccine is safe and effective, and they'll look for that one source, a video online, some kind of journal article in a medical journal somewhere that offers some degree of basis to be skeptical, and they'll use that as the information. This is the sort of thing that happens all the time. It's not just, again, something specific to COVID and the vaccination in this case. It's just a human trait, human behavior. And so when you get to how do you overcome that with people, a lot of it's just the hard work of conversation and realizing that in the end, without a mandate for people to get vaccinated, conversations and persuasion really will be where a lot of this goes in terms of having a vaccination uptick in the Ozarks.
All right, Dr. Brian Calfano breaking down the findings of a research and analysis of media study from an anonymous panel. Thank you so much for joining us. And again, we would like to thank you for watching and Dr. Morton and Dr. Barb for being part of our discussion here today. We'll put this entire segment on vaccine hesitancy on ozarksfirst.com. Thanks for watching.